stand up. And Jackson Sanchez. They are actually pages for my brother J.R. Clays, but they are my nephews. And to my left, or to their left, that's my sister Jana. And to their right is my daughter Jordan. So, welcome.
Senator Francisco's also got a special guest today. So,
thank you, Mr. Chair. I have Alina Shipley with me as a page today, and she decided it would be more fun to come to the Utilities Committee than to climb up the dome.
made a wise decision. Well, I'm excited today. We got a speaker that comes to us from Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Dr. David Mukes. He's a doctor, professor emeritus, Center for Energy Studies, Louisiana State University. And I think you all, instead of me reading all this, you've got a copy of his background. But David, at the bottom, received his master's and doctor's in economics from Florida State University. And when you read through that, he's got a lot of experience. The other thing that jumped out at me was David also serves as a distinguished fellow and senior economist with the Institute for Energy Research in Washington, D.C., and is a senior fellow at the Institute of Public Utilities at the Michigan State University. So David's been along. It's an honor to have you here, Doctor, and I'm welcome to Kansas. I'm going to turn it over to you.
Okay. Can y'all hear me? Good. All right, great. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Mr. Chair, for having me here this afternoon. Other senators, thanks for the invitation. This afternoon, what I would like to do is just talk a little bit about this energy transition that's going on and kind of how we got to where we are right now. What is this kind of inflection point we're going through and kind of maybe where we may be going into the future. Before I go through this, let me give you some takeaways on what I'm going to talk to you this afternoon about. If you look at where we've been over the last 2 decades and you think about the energy business, we've spent a lot of time working on developing high-cost renewable energy and integrating those resources into the grid throughout the country, whether you've been in the Pacific Northwest or the Western Interconnect or anywhere along the Eastern Seaboard and even down in the Gulf South region. We've spent billions of dollars not only in bringing those generation resources online, but a lot of investment in transmission and other resources to interconnect those with load centers all throughout the United States. There have also been a variety of indirect subsidies that have been paid, as well as what I will call a number of de-risking activities that have been done for many of these investments. But the focus has been really on a lot of these areas. Admittedly, as I'll talk about later, not only are these resources intermittent, but a lot of times they're unavailable during hours that we need them for serving peak loads in the summertime or early in the morning in the wintertime when we need it for electric-driven heating loads. And that has not been a super big problem up until just recently, right? Over the last 5, 10, 15 years, well, not 15, but probably the last 10 years or so, we've seen relatively low load growth. And so in the power business, if you are a utility and you were seeing about 1% growth a year, you were doing really well, as opposed to in the 1990s or in decades prior to that, where you would have anywhere from 3 to 4% or even 5, 6% if you date back into the 70s and the 80s. Just a really low growth period, but that's about to change. And we're going to talk about that today and why that's going to change. We're really getting a perfect storm of events that are starting to stack up right now that I'm going to make the argument for today and why it's very, very important for, I think, policymakers, whether you're at the legislature here in Kansas or even up in D.C. and Congress, to think about these changes and what they mean for both adding supply resources as well as what it's going to mean down on the demand side for consumers. Because ultimately, these are consumers, these are households, these are businesses, these are industries that are looking to locate and expand their opportunities everywhere. So let's move forward a little bit. Let me talk about this development of the intermittent resources and some of the challenges that this has provided over the last decade or so. This is a chart. It's a little bit busy, but the straightforward point in all of this is we've seen a pretty considerable decrease. You can't really see this on the screen very well, but you can see the decrease in solid fuel resources, coal, flatlining, and a decrease slightly of nuclear resources, our big base load generation that we've used for decades upon decades. A lot of those facilities were built during the 70s, the 80s, came along in the early 1990s. 90s. Many are being retired at an exponentially increasing rate, and you can see that clearly with the coal facilities. While we've seen some increases in natural gas generation over the last couple of decades, we've seen a corresponding increase mostly focused on renewable energy, and natural gas really serving more in a backup role for some of that renewable energy than a source of new capacity in and of itself. That has been particularly true. That was a U.S. chart, so this is a chart that's looking at those same trends for Kansas alone as for the state alone. And you see those shares dedicated to renewable energy are actually even higher due to the wind resources here in the state. So following those trends, but maybe a little bit more aggressively than we've seen in other places. Many of you are familiar with the Southwest Power Pool, which is the regional transmission organization that governs a lot of the interaction and planning at the high voltage level for Kansas and many other places in the mid-continent region. And if you look at where the current resource mix is, the generation that is applying for interconnection into those regional transmission organizations, you see it's still very heavily dedicated towards renewable energy resources. Overall, for the interconnect in total, for the SPP in total, about 88% or of 112 gigawatts. Or 112,000 megawatts of capacity is renewable-based. The thermal-based capacity there is about 13,000, mostly about 11% dedicated to natural gas. So if you're looking at generation that can actually meet during these off-peak periods when a lot of sun and wind is not available, that's what you're going to need for that backup. And you can see we just don't have a lot. You'll notice there is no coal on that chart, and I'm not advocating that there should be or not, but just when you think about what's going to back things up on a forward-going basis, there's just not a lot there. You look at Kansas only, again, much like the chart that I showed you before, similar trends, but a little bit more exaggerated, closer to 94% of that capacity that is located within Kansas alone, that's in that interconnection process is dedicated to renewables. About 6 of that is for alternative energy. 6%, sorry, is for thermal energy. If you look at the effective load carrying capabilities of these resources, that's another challenge. What I mean by those, that technical term, that ELCC, it's the availability of those resources to meet peak. And so a low number is not good, a large number is very good. Battery storage does really good when it's running and operating and charged, so you'll see very large numbers for that. When you start thinking about the renewable itself, like wind, it's somewhere down around 13%. You look at natural gas, those numbers are going to be somewhere 60, 70, 80%, depending on the resource your mix you're looking at. So when you're thinking about what resources are out there going to be available during those 5, 6, 7 o'clock hours in the summer, or 8, 9, 10 o'clock in the morning in the winter, these are usually not the resources that are there. They provide us a lot of abundant, low-cost energy when they're running. Don't get me wrong, this is very cost-effective energy when it's running, but when you need it for meeting that capacity requirement, when we're going to talk about today, and the thing that I want to emphasize today is the capacity needs for the market, not the energy needs for the market. We've got some challenges that are starting to arise. Where has the capital investment been, and what are the implications of that been over the last several years? All utilities, this is just sorted out from Standard & Poor's for all the large electric and multi-utilities that's combined natural gas and electric utilities that are investor-owned and publicly traded. You can see a relatively steady increase, and in the purple chart, you can see that that is increasing considerably on a forward-going basis. Several hundred billions of dollars that are looking to continue to be invested, but you need to decompose those numbers and find out where they're at, and you can see through this second chart here that I've got, the purple area is much increased when it comes to the transmission and lines associated with moving a lot of those intermittent resources that are in remote locations that I talked about before. So that pre-2024 number is somewhere around 6%. We're looking at anywhere from 7 to 15% depending on where you include 2018 or not, that outlier in 2028, which is, my guess, probably subject to revisions and a revision upward. You're probably on the back side of the CapEx budget, where some people have budgeted for it and some people haven't, so the averages kind of tend to drop out. Department of Energy has also looked at what these capacity requirements would be over time, and you can see on the bottom of the x-axis how, as your clean energy requirements, your renewable energy requirements increase, you're going to need more and more supporting capital investment to interconnect those renewable energy resources, and those are scaled in billions, so that 1,000 there is trillions. So you can see some of the numbers somewhere around 1.5 trillion, a lot of those in the several hundreds of millions of dollars as those percent increase. So a continued significant amount of investment that will need need to be made in order to meet those resources that are just in the interconnection queue that we have right now. For the Southwest Power Pool, they're looking at a budget for 2024 that's somewhere over 18 times the 10-year average, and projections are equally large for that too. This is not the only RTO that is experiencing these kinds of large increases. I've got a chart up here for MISO. I know Kansas is not in there, but just to give you some context and perspective, we're seeing equally large increases there. And we can flip over and look at the PJM, which is mostly in the Midwestern part and the Mid-Atlantic part of the United States. Also relatively consistently large investments in those transmission assets in those areas. So what are the capacity challenges? What are the things that we're seeing mostly that are increasing more problems for meeting peak load requirements and growing loads that we're going to see on a forward-going basis? Again, right now, the forecast is that we have somewhere around half, or 40, a little under half of the resource mix dedicated to renewable energy. And those are great for climate change goals. They're great for reducing greenhouse gas emissions. They're great for reducing other types of criteria pollutants as well. But if you need to meet big, strong load requirements in the industrial sector or for data centers or for other things, those intermittent kind of resources are going to be a bit of a problem. If we continue to have 1% or less growth, probably not a big issue. If we're looking at growth rates that are somewhere around 3-4%, we're going to have some problems right now. There's just not enough capacity out there to meet those loads. If you look at where the SPP is forecasted, their reserve margins, you can see historically they've used somewhere around 13%. They've increased that recently up to 15%. On a forecasted basis, they're looking at some of those outlying years of some serious problems going below those planning levels, those typically accepted planning levels on a forward-going basis. You look at the emergency load alerts that we've had over the last several years. They've been picking up in both the Eastern and the Western interconnect. These are instances where RTOs have notified load-serving entities that they need to shed loads because there's a problem with supply meeting demand in those particular hours. And so these are problems that are growing as well. Just in our inherent demand, our intrinsic demand that we've got right now, we already have some big challenges for that as well. So what have we added? We've spent a lot of money. We've put a lot of money down on renewable energy. We've made a lot of transmission investments. Have we gotten a lot of capacity growth to meet those requirements? And I think we've alluded a little bit that we don't. What has this meant for reliability? What has it meant for bills and for rates? I mean, at the end of the day, you all regulate in one way or another the utility business, and you know your constituents are concerned about rates, whether they're running a business or their own households. What I've got here are just the retail trends and electricity rates for the U.S. average. This is in Kansas alone. This is just a trend that we're seeing throughout the U.S. And you can see over the last 5 to 8 years, this almost hockey stick increase in electricity rates that have been paid not only by residential customers, but that line below that has seen a pretty large increase for those industrial customers as well. So for some states, those numbers have been higher. For others, they've been lower. But this is a trend we're seeing everywhere around the U.S. If you look at energy affordability, which is becoming an increasingly big challenge from a public policy perspective, I know a lot of regulators are concerned about this. I've got 2 lines here. When I first started looking at many of these trends, and what I mean by energy affordability is taking essentially, it's a quotient. You're looking in the numerator at your energy expenses, and the denominator is essentially your income, right? And so is that going up? We see those bills going up, those rates going up that I showed you before, they going down. Now you'll look at that dark line and you can see that it's actually going down a little bit, and you're thinking, well, it's becoming more affordable, right? And that number would probably tell you, yeah. And I was looking at it originally saying, well, that's a little contrary to what I would expect. We've seen rates go up, so why would that be going up? We know real incomes have been somewhat flat over the last couple of years, so what's going on here? When I got down into those numbers, when you for national income accounting, when we put these statistics together for personal income, one of the things that gets included in that is transfers from the federal government. So the increases that we've seen in transfer payments and in Medicare and in Medicaid and other things will go into that. So if you were to, the bottom line, if you were to strip those out and just look at your real income, that's what the purple line is. And so if you're looking at your real dollars, essentially that you have, that you've made in terms of compensation, there is a big increase. Notice that this is also at the median level, not at the lower income level. So this is just all average consumers at the U.S. level. And so to me, it signals, as somebody who, you know, in spirit of full disclosure, I do work a lot for consumers. I do work a lot for merchant power developers. I do a lot of work for the oil and gas business as well. But in my hat where I'm working for consumers, whether they be industrial or the residential customers, this is a problem. I have lots of people that represent residential customers, attorney generals, consumer staffs, commission staffs all over the United States that are increasingly looking at these being a problem. Again, this is just for The median household level, these charts are for the lower 20th percentile. So for those people that are in lower income categories, this number is worse. That red line down there is essentially what we refer to as the burdensome line. Anything above 6% of your income is considered a burdensome expense. And so you can see those numbers once you, if you don't you leave the transfer payments in there, it's just a little bit above that. You factor that out, those numbers get dramatically different. Again, I think showing that at the lowest percentile, proportionally more of those transfers are going down into that category, hence the big difference between the two. So again, we spend a lot of money on a lot of things, making electricity very, very expensive for a lot of households and for a lot of businesses. What about emission reductions? You know, a lot of people will come up and argue, well, you know, we need to do these to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and I'm not going to disagree. This chart, if you were to take both of these series and stack them upon one another, you can see that we've seen significant reductions in greenhouse gas emissions over the last 2 decades in the power generation sector only. But the dark purple is those that we have seen reduced from fuel switching to natural gas. The purple ones, the lighter purple ones, are from renewable energy. So if we're looking at where we've gotten the biggest bang for the buck in terms of the emissions reductions, they've been on those gas side additions. They haven't necessarily been on the renewable side because we're just not getting the effective capacity reductions and generation reductions that we need at those levels. So are we hitting a new, so what does this mean for a new era if we are in fact hitting a new era for energy demand? Are we or are we not? What would be doing that? And I'd like to wrap up my discussion today by making the argument that we are, and we're hitting it very quickly, and it's going to be very important, and we don't want to miss kind of the inflection point in all of this. If you look throughout most of the 1990s, and again, this is not an exact chart. This is more stylized to make a point that I'm trying to make here. We saw a lot of use per customer growth during the 90s. Y'all think back in the 90s, this is when we were the dot-com era. We were moving to digital technologies. You can this was the internet boom. Prior to that time period, few households had computers in them. Throughout the 90s, we had 1 or 2 of them. You can remember the old plasma televisions that threw off lots of heat and used a lot of, you wouldn't want to stand too close to them or you'd melt. You know, there was a lot of electricity used. Since that time, we've gotten a lot more efficient. You'll notice that inflection point being somewhere around 2005. That was when we had our energy price crisis. Natural gas got very expensive. A lot of utilities started going out and adopting energy efficiency and conservation programs. The federal government itself started to adopt a large number of appliance efficiency standards and changes, and electricity went through the last 10 years or so a relatively flat period, and that's kind of where we've been, that flat period, adding the capacity for renewables, not a big deal because we don't need a lot of new net incremental capacity. But as we look on that outer trend, as we move out into the next decade, into 2030, these things are changing. And there's a lot of reasons why, and I'm going to make the argument that we could be entering into a new period that makes the 90s look weak. And that's how rapid a lot of this growth can be. This is just, I gave a presentation in Salt Lake City to the Energy Council, and this is just how much since I gave that presentation, the 23 forecast to the 24 forecast has changed. The original forecast was up by 19 gigawatts. The second one was up by 88 gigawatts in new power demand requirements. For those of you who aren't super familiar with what that means, you know, 1 gigawatt's probably a nuclear power plant. So that's 19 and 88 right there alone. And those numbers are only going to get more steep as we move forward. Why? Well, a lot of reasons. I know there's been a big emphasis, and I am going to talk a lot about data centers and computational requirements, but that's not the only thing going on. We've got energy production and manufacturing requirements in this country. The administration that has just come in has made a goal of producing 3 million barrels more of crude oil a day. Let me tell you something, it's more than just putting a drill string down in the ground. It needs a lot of energy to do that too, right? If you're going to refine crude oil, another 3 million barrels, you're going to need a lot of electricity to go along with it. If you're going to refine natural gas liquids, you're going to refine LPGs, you got to have electricity to do it. All these things require additional energy. You're talking about 3 million more a day. That is going to be a big Herculean jump. So energy is going to be part of that. Industrial electrification. A lot of industries have been moving forward with electrification, moving a lot of their end uses inside the fence line to electric as opposed to combustion activities to minimize essentially the combustion and the emissions footprint of those facilities. We're all familiar with the changes that have been going on with transportation. Electric vehicles at both the state and the federal level, incentives for those. commercial and building electrification, and last but importantly, these data centers. And I think the data centers are the thing that is, some of these have been emerging and growing. Some have been growing a little bit more rapidly over the last couple of years, like transportation electrification. Data centers, to me, have been the catalyst that has really pushed us over the edge in terms of where we're going and how things are changing. As I mentioned before, these movement towards electrification on the industrial side goes back some time. We've been doing that since the Clean Air Act amendments in 1992. If you work in the oil and gas business, a lot of your field uses have switched over to, from natural gas to electricity to reduce your environmental footprint. If you're at a refinery or a petrochemical facility, you've moved away from using spare fuels or natural gas to electricity. Some of the problems that we had with Winter Storm Uri had to do with this interrelationship between power and production upfield. We didn't have electricity to run compression and pumps at the field level, so we couldn't get natural gas, and one finger's pointing at the other finger. And those are some of the problems that we have from electrification. That is only going to get worse. It's not going to get any better as more and more industrial applications move to electricity. We've also seen a big growth in industrial demand because of the shale revolution. Natural gas is like a feedstock. It's like flour for a baker, and you can make biscuits and beignets and baguettes and all kinds of things with that flour. We can do that with natural gas. So if you look at the states that have had the fastest industrial growth, they've been the ones that have been energy producers that have leveraged essentially the low-cost shale resources. So you got North Dakota where the Bakken is. You've got Texas that's up there at the top of the list, where you have the Permian, New Mexico with the Permian as well. You've got Oklahoma and Louisiana as respective energy producing states. Lots of big industrial growth, lots of big industrial electrification going on at that time period. That's what's happened over the last decade. As we look forward, it's going to the new industry of the future, the new that's going to add on to that play is not worked out on the industrial side, is going to be these data centers. And data centers do a lot of things. I know when you hear about this, in the news and in the media, there's a big focus on crypto, a big focus on AI, but those applications probably collectively somewhere around 10, 30%. There may be individual centers that do a lot more than others, but on average, they're small. Now, it is admittedly going to be the growth sector as we move forward. But when you think about what a lot of these centers do today, they're things that impact your various lives, right? Like cloud computing. Everybody does cloud computing. I'm sure everybody in the Senate here remembers when y'all had your own server somewhere. The Senate had them, committees had them, your businesses had them. Now all that stuff's in the cloud. Even if you're a small business, you got stuff in the cloud. That's got to be hosted somewhere. Those data centers do that. Content delivery networks. If you want to sit around and watch Netflix, or you want to watch Amazon Prime, you got to get that distributed to various different data centers so they can feed that to you in quicker speeds and more reliable speeds. That's what data centers do. Enterprise data and storage and processing, just a little step up from what we have in cloud computing. Telecommunication services, right? How many people talk on a landline phone anymore? Not too many, right? COVID ruined that for everybody, right? Now it's Zoom, now it's Teams, and it's your cell phone, right? As a small business guy, I can tell you I'm very upset that I spent a lot of money on a $2,000 phone system. Nobody knows how to use it now because everybody uses Zoom. We don't have to use those big systems anymore. And they're all going over these data centers, and that's only going to increase. And the old user of supercomputing and high big data centers that's still out there is in research in universities. There's a lot of high-speed computation that goes on, a lot of high-involved computation that goes on, optimization of algorithms, much like crypto and data mining wind up doing today. These are all things that universities and research institutes do, particularly in healthcare. But AI and crypto are clearly going to be the things of the future as we move forward, and really, again, within this sector, I think serving as catalyst. There are a lot of different players out there. Obviously, people are familiar with Amazon, Google, Microsoft, Meta. There are some independent third parties that are out there developing many of these hyperscale facilities like Equinix and Digital Reality and some of the other big firms that are doing them on a third-party basis and leasing out to some of the big providers as well. Who are the users, though? I mean, think about what this means. Even if you don't have a lot of data centers in your state, you may have things in your state that are growing, that are engines of economic development that rely on this. So if you're big in healthcare services, healthcare is going to be a big consumer of what these data centers have to offer. If you're into technology and computation, you're going to be into that area. As I mentioned before, if you're into entertainment, and in retail services, in e-commerce, you're going to rely on these kinds of things. So even if you don't have the data center, seeing the success of this business is going to be important for you as well for economic development purposes. This is a forecast that was done by Boston Consulting Group. You can find a forecast for just about everybody out there, showing thousands of megawatts in various different RTO regions in the United States. The point being is there are thousands of megawatts, right? And no matter how you cut this down, you just can't, there's nobody out there that says, oh, this is, there are a lot of people out there, and I would caution you to be wary of those that think of this as a flash in the pan. I don't want to oversell it, and I think there is some healthy skepticism that's warranted in some of this, but we're still looking at, even under conservative estimates, a lot of new requirements in these areas. You just look over the last year or so at where commercial growth in electricity has been, which is where a lot of this stuff is measured at the commercial level, not the industrial level. Where are they coming from? States like Virginia and Texas. Why Virginia and Texas? Because that's where all the data centers are, right? They're all in that DC area in the suburbs in Virginia. They're in Austin, where Tesla and everybody else is, Dell is, all those other people. EPRI is the Electric Power Research Institute. They are the premier research institute for the electric power industry. Various different scenarios, even the low scenario is 3.7%. Remember, I was telling you before, 1% was what we were hoping to get. If this sector alone is growing at 3.7%, they're going to be 5% of overall load by the next decade. I would say 5 to 10% is probably going to be more likely, but some projections are as high as 15% growth for some of these industries. And you can see it's just exponentially growing. You can look at this table on your own, but there's this is a big engine in and of itself of economic development. Do want to caution you, there are lots of jobs there, tens of thousands of jobs, but do keep in mind that those are for the development of those data centers. Once those data centers are developed and built, the employment that goes with that's usually very, very small, if not de minimis. And that's not something to frown upon per se. I mean, from an economic development perspective, you get a big tax base. You got a lot of local property tax assessments that can come from this depending on how many incentives you've got on the books. And you don't have a lot of pressure on social services. Like if you had a Toyota plant come in or a Nissan plant, and you got lots of families coming in, you got to build roads to accommodate the traffic moving into the plant. You got to build new schools. You got to build all the new infrastructure. You don't have these with these data centers by and large. It's really this power and this energy infrastructure that you've got to worry about. Couple of things in the news recently. So there was an announcement right after the new administration, I think 3 days after Trump took office, that there was as much as $500 billion that OpenAI, Oracle, and SoftBank were willing to put into AI development and AI infrastructure in the United States, i.e. data centers. There have been a lot of criticisms about this. It's too grandiose. It's really not going to happen. My argument is, okay, let's assume half does. That's still $250 billion on this. Couple of little statistics to keep in mind in this. The last time we had a very big build out of thermal generation was during the Enron days from 1998 to 2001 or 2, depending on where you want to cut that off. I can't think of anything since that time period where we've seen lots of natural gas generation built. We announced 500 gigawatts of capacity during then, only 250 got developed. Every billion is usually a gigawatt of power. That's 500 gigawatts. That's more than what we did during the Enron days and power requirements, right? So again, I'm not saying that's what's going to happen, but if this does materialize, and this is just one announcement, right? This is not all the others that could be dropping after this. Then within 3 weeks later, we get this announcement from DeepSeek, an alternative AI model that's developed in China that may be revolutionizing the business before it even gets off the ground and being double the efficiency of what we normally use in these AI models in the algorithms that solve for this. And as a consequence, using about half as much in the power requirements, probably representing half as much in the need. You saw oil and gas stocks kind of start tanking the day after this announcement came. Power requirements starting to, power trading's going down those days. And I kind of laughed about this because everybody just in one day's worth of announcements, something in China that we can't prove one way or another, and the market just goes off like lemmings into the ocean. Even if this were true, even if it's just half, we're still looking at a big amount of development. I think almost likely a historic level. And we've seen that happen because of the shale revolution. I think this new data revolution that we're talking about could be the growth of things like we've seen in the 1990s, which was one of an changing time in history for the U.S. I'd be cautioned about some of this. One, the current data center supply is below demand. So right now, we still have a big gap we got to make up. So that's going to minimize the negativity with this. Second, as I mentioned before, 10, 20, maybe 30% of that energy use is going to be AI related. So it's not all of it. Cloud computing is not going away. Content delivery is not going away. All these other activities are not going away. They're going to drive opportunities for data centers. And the efficiency associated with that and the energy requirements aren't changing. And as I mentioned before, even if half of this happens, it's still going to be a lot. So it's something to keep in mind. A lot of utilities, I'm going to skip this and just leave that for you all to look at on your own, since we're getting a little pressed for time. But a lot of utilities are looking at trying to accommodate these centers quickly. A lot of regulatory commissions are reviewing tariff offering. There are a number of different things where they're kind of trying to carve out these loads and create service opportunities. I think that's a great thing, going out and doing that. There's nothing to me that says I'm open for business like being very clear and transparent on what I'm going to offer you. So in-use qualifications, making sure that these are dedicated to these kinds of technology providers. Minimum load qualifications, you got to have 100 megawatts, 200 megawatts, whatever it is, the utility needs to make that decision. Minimum contract terms, you got to be there for 5, 10, 15 years. Contract termination penalties, if you bail out, you got to pay me. Minimum billing demand, if you've got a peak demand of 100 in any month, you got to pay me 70, 80 of that, even if you don't use it. And then collateral requirements to make sure you don't skip town and you're not viable, financially viable. All of those, I think, help offset some of these concerns that you've seen that somebody else may have to pay for this. I will be the first person in here, because I do represent a lot of consumer interests, to tell you that you need to be very careful about that. We want to make sure that nobody's getting a free ride in all this. But in my negotiations and work that we've been doing in this area, we found that surprisingly and refreshingly, a lot of data centers have been willing to pony up and to make their investments that they need to back a lot of this stuff up. So, but I do think there are important things to keep in mind and consider from a policy perspective. So let me wrap this up and open it up for some questions if you have any. But what do we need? I think more reliable natural gas-fired generation is going to be it. There may be other opportunities as we move down the road, but this is something that's moving at the speed of business. In the next 36 to 60 months, if you haven't gotten on board, you're done. You missed it, right? I do think this will peter out. This isn't going to be an exponentially growing thing. I think the power requirements are going to be significant. But just think about what normally happens in industries like this. They become more competitive. They become more efficient. The needs start to change. So as you start to get out after 5 years, the future looks a little bit more foggier. You can tell my accent there. Utility accountability, I think, is important in all of this too. Making sure that they're part of the solution, not a part of the problem. In some states, we've seen that be more of the solution than the problem. In some places, I've seen it be more of the problem than solution. Recognizing you got a lot of economic development opportunities, not just in the data centers themselves, but what they leverage, right? Having big technology developed in your state is great, right? Because you're going to need lots of fiber to come into that state. Well, guess who else gets the benefit to have that fiber and all that computational resource in the state? You do, right? So there's a lot of spillover effects to this as well. And even if you don't, if you've got healthcare, you've got other ththings that you focus on that do rely on this, they'll benefit from this as well. But I think it is important that everybody pays their fair share. There are no cross subsidies. I think it's a great thing from a legislative perspective, right? You want to be able to promote these industries and not have to put up a big fiscal impact in all of this. And I don't think a lot of people are asking for that in all of this. They just want market barriers removed and people and be able to move quickly on these things and get regulatory burdens reduced. I think that's the big ticket item in all of this. And again, I don't think this is really run, pitch, catch type stuff. There's no regulatory gimmicks or solves or quick fixes or anything like that. Just do your job, remove the barriers, let people do their thing, let the market decide. There's no incentives that are needed. You don't need to make the investments. We don't need ratepayer investments in these dollars. This is a market that's very well prepared, much like the unconventional revolution was in oil and gas, to fund its own way. They didn't need any incentives for that industry either, and I think we're seeing that too, which is great there. Thank you again, Mr. Chairman, for having me today. This is my contact information. Y'all got the presentation, but anytime in the future you want to follow up, you can reach out anytime. And with that, I've got time for questions if you do.
Thank you, Doctor, very much. I knew there'd be some questions here. Senator Thompson.
Thank you. Excellent presentation, Doctor. I appreciate it very much. We've heard like Google and some of those bigger companies considering creating their own generating plants. Will that ameliorate? I don't think it'll ameliorate the need for extra generating capacity, but will it help significantly, or do you see that to be a trend with some of the bigger companies.
I do. I am net bullish on that. And if you think about it from a consumer perspective or ratepayer, I think there are going to be utilities that have differing opinions on that. So I'll let them speak for themselves on that. I think some are supportive of that, some are not. It really just depends. But to the extent that these data centers can do that, I think they should be facilitated, provided that they're following state laws, siting requirements, et cetera, not having any negative externalities. I think that's an important aspect of it. And the other thing that I've cautioned about in all of this too is comparability and equity. And what I mean by that is you don't want to start affording data centers all these wonderful opportunities for lowering their energy costs, et cetera, and then ignoring the Toyota plant or ignoring the refinery or ignoring the textile plant or the wood chip plant down the road too. So you need to be cautious about that too. If you're going to start affording these energy opportunities behind the meter to data centers, well, what does it mean for these other folks? And that's when I think you really start getting utilities real nervous. So it's a complicated thing. I tend to like that, but there are other different opinions on that too.
Yeah, real follow-up, if I may. Yeah, that important point. Because if they do generate their own capacity, you know, then you've got these ratepayers supporting all the infrastructure surrounding this. And the ratepayers' rates are going to go up anyhow, whereas these individual corporations may be able to insulate themselves from that cost.
Yeah, but again, if you go back to some of those terms and conditions that we're seeing in the tariffs right now, you got a minimum demand requirement. You're going to be on the hook for some pretty big financial requirements on this. I've been, quite frankly, very surprised that industries would sign up for some of these deals. In my experience on large industry like petrochemical facilities, LNG facilities, et cetera, these are some things that would make some of these big guys usually balk, but these guys have not balked on some of these things. So I'm a little less worried about that. I still think it's important to be worried about it. I absolutely agree with you. And where you get a lot of those problems at the RTO level, that bypasses the KCC, it bypasses you, they're going to do what they're going to do, and I can't give you a good answer on that one. Right?
Concern. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Senator Bowser.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Can you pronounce your last name for me?
Dismukes.
Dismukes.
Yes, sir.
Thank you, Dr. Dismukes. I really enjoyed your presentation. I have two questions. I have long suspected this, but this is the first time I've seen it in writing. I'm going to quote your chart, your presentation. A new era of electricity growth that will need to be powered with a reliable, non-intermittent electricity source. So renewables aren't going to cut it.
They're not. I mean, and look, most of the people that are coming to town with these data centers have already got their renewable requirements backed up already. They've been driving a lot of the investment in solar and in wind. They've executed the contracts for differences. They're going to cover that. Let them cover that. But they're going to, and most of them will tell you, I need the power when I turn it on.
So kind of question number one, I think, so what do we need to do here in Kansas? I think according to your chart, we need to probably increase our natural gas generation capacity, I guess would be.
Well, and
or is
the
it
full disclosure, I do work for the oil and gas industry, so I do want to leave that out there. But yeah, I mean, I think right now, I don't know that there needs to be a lot done actively, but removing barriers to that kind of development and understanding and appreciating that it is an all-of-the-above solution. I think we paid a lot of lip service to that over the last 10 years and haven't acted on it. Those charts would prove that. We need to start moving that pendulum back the other way. There's room for everybody at the table.
And my second question here is around capital investments. What do you typically see? Are you seeing, is it mostly private investments? Is it public is it kind of a public-private partnership on these capital investments? What do you?
Most of those are all private. I
Yeah.
mean, they're coming out of their banks.
So, okay, thank you. Very good.
You're welcome.
Great presentation.
Thank you.
Committee, we have any other questions? Senator Francisco.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We didn't hear much about batteries other than, you know, how long wind or solar might take. And the committee was lucky enough to have a informational hearing on batteries recently. So how do you see that fitting in with all this other demand?
You know, batteries are great in supplemental peak hours, but you're going to still need to wind up having those larger thermal requirements to meet the overall hourly requirement that these facilities are going to have. Secondly, is batteries are expensive. I can put in a combined cycle plant a lot cheaper than I can do a battery. And the combined cycle plant's there all the time. It can give me low-cost energy when the battery's already drained. And it's just a lot more, it has a lot more callability to it. I'm not trying to throw shade on that or renewables in any of this. I'm just saying, as I mentioned before, you know, having that pendulum move back the other direction is probably about timely.
Okay, committee. Doctor, how do you see thermal You know, you hear about that, and I think they had a plant, didn't they, out in Utah?
What's that?
You know, where you drill down and
The
you pick it
geothermal?
up? Yeah.
Yeah, again, these are all interesting applications, hydrogen, et cetera, but they, in this day and age, I think they're niche applications. I think they'll be out there and they'll be important components of continuing to mitigate greenhouse gas emissions. But they're going to be technically isolated to the areas where you've got that. So historically, they've been out in the Rocky West, and then they do have some lower heat ones that are along the Gulf Coast region. But I think, you know, we've done some work at LSU on that from a research perspective. It's anytime you've got an energy application that has a lot of moving parts to it, you're having to do a lot of mitigation, a lot of heat recovery, a lot of other things that have lots of parts that can break. It creates reliability issues. It creates increased costs, et cetera. And geothermal is one of those. You're going to have a problem with them, right?
Next question would be nuclear. When I looked at your chart through 2050, nuclear is not growing very much.
Yeah, yeah. You know, given the recent experiences, I don't see that happening. You know, I'm optimistic. Many of you remember that old TV show, The X-Files, and they had Fox Mulder down in the basement, and he had that poster over his head that says, "I want to believe," with the UFO on it. I'm kind of that way when it comes to nuclear. I want to believe that we can get that to work at some point, but the first thing I worked on in this business in 1988 was a nuclear power plant fiasco, and the problems have never gotten solved over the last close to 4 decades I've been doing this. And as long as it costs 33, 34, 35 billion dollars to build a nuclear power plant, I don't care if it runs on buttermilk, it's just not going to go. It's just too much of a financial risk, and very few players in the market can do that. Only a big, well-capitalized electric utility can do that. So maybe small modular reactors, but people have been saying that for as long as I can remember too. We'll see. I don't think that the NRC currently has a commercial, a construction and operating license framework for that right now. So that would have to be done first. You know, as we see where these will be backed up on a forward-going basis in the next 2 decades, maybe nuclear, but right now I just don't see it.
So I think it's France that has nuclear big time. How did they do that, or what would you say?
I have not gone through all of it, but I suspect it had to do with a lot of public backing on it, and it was nationalized in the national government. The most generation in many of these European countries, particularly these legacy facilities that were built in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, it wasn't until the 90s sometimes that you started to get privatization, and you don't get a lot of development kind of after that point. So a lot of these are more legacy facilities that I think had a lot of public backing. There's probably private companies that are running and operating them now, much like they are in the United States. Many of the people that are running and operating the nuclear power plants aren't the ones that actually built them to begin with. There are people that just focus and specialize in that industry. And so that's what you're going to need to do. And I've often said that if the U.S. government is serious about nuclear, what they need to do is set out 5 nuclear projects around the country in each region, put it up for bid, let it get developed, and then whatever the cost is, that is the cost of essentially doing it. I don't see any other way. We're really good in the United States at running nuclear power plants. Building them and getting them to operation is the challenge.
So I know, in your conclusion, the last thing is to avoid the regulatory gimmicks of the day that remove the authority and oversight of regulators and place those decisions, pricing, investment in the hands of institutional alternative agendas. You got any examples of that?
Well, I know I've seen a lot of arguments out there about reducing, moving to multi-year rate plans, moving to performance-based regulation, moving to some kind of alt-reg or incentive reg as a way to, as a cure-all on all this. And it's not going to be a cure-all. Really, it's up to the commission to do those kinds of jobs on those things and to look at them. I think particularly in this instance where we're looking at a lot of capital investment that may be coming on a regular basis, that's the time that I would like to have a regulator participating on this, not at a time of letting it go. Past 10 years, that might have been good, but I think this day and age, that's a little bit trickier.
Senator Warren.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for your very informative presentation. Also, in conclusions, I see more flexibility from policy. Do you have anything specific in mind? Or
well, I think reacting quickly, creating the opportunities for these standalone tariffs, and essentially sending out a welcome mat for these data centers and these new larger users is a big thing that in working with the oil and gas industry and other providers, that's what we've been looking at, is to carve it out, to remove the uncertainty, to know the terms and conditions that you're dealing with, and to have some transparency in what that is. I think that, and moving quickly on getting that done.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Any other questions? I think they've all been working on the budgets, what they've been doing, Doctor.
Fun stuff.
Okay, if we don't have any other questions, thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, I appreciate it.
You bet. Since this is the last meeting, be sure and take your folder with you today, is one thing. And the other thing I want to say is a special thank you to all of the committee. I have really enjoyed this. It's been a great committee. This is the A team, in my opinion, because we asked a lot of good questions and went over a lot of stuff this year. A special thank you to Nick for what he does. Jesse, she's not here, but Kate, Heather, you be sure and tell Kate I said that. Brandon, thank you for all your work. And a special thank you to my office assistant, Susie back there, because this could not happen without her. She does a great job. So with that, meeting adjourned. Thank you.